So one last person. Here we go. So good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to tonight's Avid Reader Zoom session. We have a discussion on the subject of Writing the Anthropocene, fiction as a mirror to nature and a warning of things to come. Avid Reader's very own Krissy Kneen will be your facilitator tonight. And, oops, sorry, just admitting people there. And we'll be hearing from expert panelists James Bradley, Madeleine Watts, and Lucy Treloar. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So before I leave you in Krissy's hands, I'd just like to go over some of the information that I sent to you in my email earlier with the link to tonight's event. So as we're a large group tonight, I've placed everybody on mute automatically just to avoid the potential for any disrupting noises in the background. And you'll remain so throughout the evening, but I will unmute you at the end so that you can thank our speakers for the discussion this evening. Later on, we'll likely go to a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for our panelists tonight, then please type them in the chat box. They'll all come to me and I will read them out when Krissy prompts me to do so, along with your name later on tonight. So if you drop out of the session for any reason this evening, don't worry, I'll be here to readmit you. Just click on that link that's in the email again, and you'll be admitted as soon as possible. Same thing goes for any of our panelists tonight. If somebody drops out, we'll take a quick break from the conversation while they readmit themselves, and we'll go from there. So I would now like to introduce you to Krissy Kneen. As I've already mentioned, she is a beloved member of the Avid Reader family. She's also the author of many books, including An Uncertain Grace, which has been shortlisted for the Stella Prize, as well as Wintering, which has been shortlisted for several awards. Krissy currently is also running live readings of her latest erotic short stories. The penultimate of these sessions, which is titled Lust in the Time of Coronavirus, will be held this Thursday at 8 p.m. So make sure that you follow the link on our website and sign up for that one. So Krissy, I will now hand over to you to introduce our speakers for tonight.
Thank you so much, Emma Kate. It is my absolute pleasure to be here doing this tonight because these books are fantastic, basically, and it's not always, sometimes it's, you know, a little bit of work to read a panel of books, but this was actually just a pleasure to dip into and to finish these three books. So I'll just start by introducing the session, and also I'd like to just start by acknowledging that I am meeting on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also that we are coming across to you on the lands of many other Aboriginal people. So I'd like to also pay my respects to their elders too. So if you can remember back to January, we were mourning the loss of lives, of communities, of so much forest, of masses of animals and birds killed in fires that ravaged many parts of Australia. Only a month or two later, how the world has changed. Fires and recovery are off the front pages of the newspapers, and now we are focused on the pandemic gripping the world. Briefly, the skies above Beijing were clear. Dirty city rivers began to look pristine and animals began to colonise city streets. But even the temporary shutdown of a global economy is not enough to reverse the damage done. And perhaps the history of the coronavirus itself is intertwined with the seemingly unstoppable trudge of climate change. People are anxious, and when we are anxious, we look to artists to help us make sense of the world. So tonight we have three very different books that have been released in the last few months, and all of them have a preoccupation with the ravages of climate change that are being wreaked on the world and the way that humankind is dealing with that. James Bradley is the author of a book of poetry, Paper Nautilus, and 5 novels, Rack, The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, Clade, and now Ghost Species. His books have won or been shortlisted for a number of major Australian and international literary awards and have been widely translated. James Bradley has penned Ghost Species, a book that goes forward into a world changed by natural forces while simultaneously reaching backward towards previous extinction events as scientists work towards the de-extinction of animals long gone and also humans long gone, the Neanderthals. So we welcome James Bradley tonight. We also have with us Lucy Treloar, who is the author of the novel Salt Creek, which won the Indie Award for Best Debut, the Abia Matt Ritchell Award and the Dobby Award, and was shortlisted for prizes including the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the Walter Scott Prize. Lucy has also been a recipient of the 2014 Commonwealth Short Story Prize, the Pacific Region, and the 2013 Writing Australia Unpublished Manuscript Award. Lucy works as a writer and editor in Australia as well as Cambodia, where she lived for a number of years. She teaches creative writing at RMIT in Victoria. Wolfe Island is about Kitty Hawke, the last resident of a sinking island whose life is irrevocably changed when her pregnant granddaughter rows ashore with her boyfriend and 2 young siblings who are running for their lives. It's a book set now or in the very near future, I think. Madeleine Watts grew up in Sydney and has lived in New York since 2013. She has an MFA in creative writing from the Columbia University, and her fiction has been published in the White Review and the Lifted Brow. Her novella Afraid of Waking was awarded the 2015 Griffith Review Novella Prize. Her non-fiction has appeared in The Believer and the Los Angeles Review of Books. The Inland Sea is her first novel. It's a story about the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of explorer John Oxley, who set out into the heart of Australia in the early 19th century, believing he would find an inland sea. It is about this young woman who works at an emergency call centre, repeatedly throwing herself at dangerous situations in a self-destructive frenzy. All of this playing out against the background of a planet in extreme distress. So welcome to all 3 of my authors tonight. I'm going to start by asking you all a question about your book in the current context of the pandemic. And I just wondered if you can all just briefly let me know if you feel that the context that we're living in now has changed people's view or your own view of your current books. We might start with you, Lucy.
Oh, interesting question. When the pandemic started to sort of emerge as a force, I instantly started thinking about the fictional possibilities and whether I should have squeezed something like that into my book. But I think what I was looking for was a kind of more general effect, that people would be fleeing from something unknown, because people are fleeing from unknown things in a kind of global sense. But certainly watching the entirety of it unfold in this kind of ongoing present just makes me wonder about the fictional possibilities. And I've been really interested to see what people have been doing with the idea of pandemics. There's been Meg Mundell's book and what's her name? The Melbourne writer. Anyway, I've just been really interested in those kinds of approaches but I think that they're kind of looking at a pandemic of the future, and I'm trying to work out what we might do when we've actually been through a pandemic. How would we frame that kind of material in a retrospective way? I'm not totally sure how I would deal with it, but I'm really interested in the social effects.
Thanks, Lucy. James, what do you think? Has it affected the reading of your book, having this pandemic in the world?
I think the thing that's really interesting about the pandemic is that, in a weird kind of way, what it's done is laid bare kind of the process of climate change. Because, you've got this thing where, there's a kind of a completely inexorable kind of arithmetic to infection. And the problem is that leads you very quickly to a place that just seems unimaginable. And so certainly early on and now as well, you've got lots of people who are kind of dismissing it. So in a weird kind of way, it's like watching climate except sped up to kind of days and weeks rather than years and decades. So I think that's been been really, really interesting. And I think what's been really interesting about it also is seeing, I mean, first of all, seeing the kind of processes of organised denial kick into action around this as well, which is fascinating. And, you know, if you wanted to make a circle of kind of COVID denial, a Venn diagram of COVID deniers and climate deniers, it'd probably be a circle. But I mean, I do think the thing that's been really fascinating about watching all of that is, in a weird kind of way, one of the things my book's very much about is kind of inevitability, and how do we think about inevitability, and how do we deal with it. So in an odd kind of way, it feels to me like a kind of extension of the themes of the book, if you're asking about that. I mean, in an odd kind of way, like when it started, I thought, oh my God, I've got a book coming out that's going to be terrible. And I thought, well, actually, in a weird kind of way, it's sort of about this. So, you know, I felt calmer about it.
Yeah. And Madeleine, how did you feel?
Well, the book, as it sort of stands now, is about emergency and how we deal with the emergency that we're currently in, all different sorts of emergencies. And so I think it has added another aspect to that experience of emergency. I think the experience of dealing with the emergency of climate change is much slower, and it happens in sort of micro moments of the everyday. And they're much easier to deal with. And I think that this has been a defining experience of panic for everyone in the world. And I think so I think certainly it would make it more, make reading the actual book possibly more alarming, or certainly it's not going to be calming experience.
I don't think we're all sitting calmly here in this. So I think that it's kind of life affirming to have a book which validates our sense of panic, actually. I was going to ask you about the idea. There's this fantastic thing at the heart of this book, which is that she works at the 000 call centre, which, you know, that idea that people are calling for help all the time, that kind of constant calling for help, and you get this sense that the planet is calling for help as well. Where did you, was that something that was there from the very beginning, that idea of the 000 call centre, or was that something that came later in your process?
Yeah, writing the book, I always knew that I wanted it to be about different ideas of emergency. The most autobiographical part of the book is the fact that I did work for a year at 000. So a lot of that is based on the experience of working there, which was very fragmented. It was always like a high level of panic, but you only ever got like shards of things. And so I wanted to use that kind of feeling as a baseline for feeling, to sort of wrap the book around ideas about gender and about history and about nature and how we experience it now. And it ended up being like a very Sydney-centric book, because I felt like a lot of the sort of climate change things and ideas about nature were coming through in what was happening to Sydney, especially in the years that I was writing it, when every year things got, it seemed like every single year that since I left Sydney in 2013, there's been catastrophic fires and catastrophic floods. It was like a petri dish for everything that was happening everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, look, I feel like it works really, really well. And I did feel that reading your book, it sort of validated my own sense of, you know, panic at this time and anxiety at this time. So it really actually, rather than winding me up, it actually made me calmer about the situation we're in, it's absolutely a fantastic book. Maybe you could give us a little taste of the voice of the book by reading a little bit to us now, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just read from the beginning of the book. Apologies, I have to read this. I'm not in my home. I'm a bit marooned, and I don't have a copy of my book, so I'm actually going to just read it on the side of the screen. So apologies. So this is just from the beginning of the book, and the narrator is talking about how it's incredibly hot, and there's a storm, and it's sort of calmed everything down. The morning after the storm arrived, I lay on the rocks beside the bay, and at last I was able to sleep. When I woke up, I was overheated, my body covered in sweat. I picked a way down the rocks and surveyed the brown storm surge mucking up the edges of the water. I took a leap. The day was still, the rocks deserted, and closed my eyes and began to swim out. When I'd gone far enough into the depths, I turned and looked back to where I'd been. From above, the palms and bougainvillea erupted in great green and pink swarms from the cliff face like some madman's garden of Babylon. Seagulls circled overhead. I floated in the clear water in the middle of the bay and thought that I wouldn't be so afraid to be lost at sea. The smooth blue expanse couldn't hurt me, not the one I imagined stretching out for miles and miles all the way east to Valparaiso, north to California, the tips of Alaska and Russia and Japan, eternities away from here. The sun beat down. I tread water and spread out my arms, and I observed just then, as though waking not out of but into a nightmare, a long yellow and black thing swimming in the water. The sun glinted on its scales, and it took me a moment to see it for what it actually was. I had never once seen one in the wild. When I was a child, my mother had told me how deadly they could be. She had seen them coiled on the seabed in the north of the country and washed up on the beaches of the remote Pacific islands she'd visited with my father when they were happy together. That sea snakes rarely struck didn't make them any less threatening. If they bit you, the neurotoxic venom would begin to work through your limbs before you could make it to shore. Blurred vision, numb throat, a prickle in the soles of the feet, and then a burst of pain in every cell of your body, like a fire sweeping through the nervous system and destroying everything in its path. I looked at the water, flat and silent all around me. I had swum out too far. The bay was empty. I knew that it was the most vulnerable parts of the body one needed to guard against. They bit you in the thin, fleshy spaces between your fingers and your toes. I drew my hands into fists. I kicked with my toes clenched. I swam towards the rocks, moving through the water as though I were punching it. The snake had been carried into shore overnight, swept along from warmer depths by the storm. The snake was weak, but weak things lash out. Its body rose and fell with the lap of the tide, and it moved with its mouth open.
Fabulous. And because you don't have a copy of your book, I'll hold it up here. So this is a beautiful jacket of Inland Sea. Yeah. Thank you so much for that reading, Madeleine. I'm going to come to you now, James. So in your book, we can de-extinct. Is that the word? De-extinct things from the deep past by taking cells and growing them. Do you think that having this global pandemic at the moment has given us pause about the things that we might be the things that might be emerging from the deep past, like the small, tiny things that might be emerging from the deep past, like viruses, perhaps?
I don't know. I do think that yes, that kind of the notion that you're going to get viruses coming out of particularly the permafrost seems to be real. I mean, things that, in fact, they have already. I don't know. I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting about the pandemic in many ways is that people keep talking about it as if there's going to be this kind of, certainly a month ago everyone was into, it's going to be a kinder, gentler world on the other side, and, we're all going to be better people, which seems unlikely to me. I mean, I feel a bit like what we're actually going to see is a kind of turbocharged version of the world we had before, with much greater levels of, as we move into a world that's even more divided economically, it's only going to get worse, would be my guess, my kind of Eeyore-ish response to it all. But I mean, that kind of idea of disruption and unhinging, and that sense that temporality is kind of disturbed, is something that I think, it's absolutely part of this kind of process that we're in at the moment with kind of environmental crisis, that sense that the deep past is crashing into the present, that you've got kind of geological time and human time collapsing together. But in a weird kind of way, one of the things that the pandemic is clearly about is a similar kind of disturbance of temporality. I mean, one of the enduring experiences of it has been that sense of this kind of, that you've kind of slipped into this kind of weird non-time, and that time has suddenly become very, very different. So perhaps in that sense, it might give us pause. It might make us think more about the kind of sense of disturbed temporalities. But yeah, I mean, I am broadly pessimistic, I have to say, about what the lessons we're going to take away from the pandemic are. I mean, I think, look at Australia. I mean, the lesson we're clearly going to take away from it is yet again another version of our kind of exceptionalism, and, that we somehow survived because we were cleverer and, more virtuous than everybody else, when, in fact, we were lucky and we're in an island. you know, and we responded sensibly, unlike a number of other countries. But yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced that it will change our minds about viruses.
Oh, look, if we can get something from a bat and a pangolin as we have now, what's going to come from a woolly mammoth?
Yeah. I mean, I do think the thing that is going to happen, which is interesting, is that, I mean, I think we live in a world already where people are incredibly atomized, you know, and we live in a world where it's quite possible to live without having any real contact with people. You know, you can interact with everybody on social media, you can order your food, you know, you operate in a kind of weirdly precarious employment environment. And I think that drives a kind of isolation and atomization of people's behavior. And I think this is going to make it worse, because now what we've done is made, you know, a whole lot of stuff about bodies deeply weird. You know, I mean, people are already doing it. And I had some guy, you know, shout at me in the street today because I didn't stand aside as he walked past, you know, and it was kind of like, well, dude, you know, you didn't stand aside either. You know, but it's, you know, I think it's going to weird up all of that stuff around bodies very much.
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of your book, James, with a little bit of a reading?
Sure. I'll just read a little bit. In fact, I'll read the beginning. All right. I have to find it, sorry. Okay. Some nights when the wind is up and the power flickers and fails, she tells the child stories, as if this thread of words might be enough to bind them together, to bear them through all that is to come, like a boat or a leviathan. She knows she is not alone in despairing for what the future holds, in wanting to find ways to hold it back for as long as possible. But no matter how hard she tries, she cannot keep it at bay forever, for a time is coming, soon, sooner than she wants it to be, sooner than either of them will be ready, when the child will have to venture forth into the world we have made and find a way to survive. The onrush of that time, the feeling that their years together are already falling away, shadows her life, a drumbeat of loss behind the moments of joy, a reminder every instant is precious. But when they are here, isolated by the power or the wind, it is not time's flight that frightens her. Instead, it is the knowledge that the child is alone, and that one day soon she will understand that. And so she does what mothers have done since the beginning of time, since before we were human. She draws filaments from the darkness and weaves them together to create meaning, purpose, shape, arranging the elements to reveal the world, or perhaps to make a new one. Before the child, if you had suggested this might be something she could do, she would have laughed, told you she was not a storyteller. But in the years since the child arrived in her life, she has found the habits of breath and suspense that make a story live were already there, waiting within her, just as the eagerness for it is in the child, her capacity for rapt attention. How far back does this strand of connection go, she sometimes wonders. Did we require language to discover story? Or did language evolve to sustain story? Are we the only animals that tell stories? Do the birds, the fish, the elephants, the whales and dolphins? And if they do, what shape do those stories take? For surely story is as much a way of being in the world as a way of describing it, a means of comprehending the way all that surrounds us hums through us as we live.
Fantastic. That's really beautiful. It's amazing how you've, you know, from a story that really deals with a lot of science, you've drawn the poetry out of it. You really have. It's great. Thanks, James. Lucy, I want to talk a little bit about voice, because the thing that really struck me in your book was the voice of Kitty that narrates the whole story. And she has a really very unique and particular voice, and the book echoes with this voice. Was that one of, you know, how did you come to find the voice of Kitty that defines this book?
If I had to describe myself as a writer, I would say I was a voice writer, and that the search for a voice very early in the project is incredibly important to me. And if I don't have that voice, I really can't move on. And so early on, I started writing, but it wasn't progressing terribly well. And I was procrastinating one day, which I recommend for all writers, and came across a reading of Elizabeth Bishop. And she was reading this fantastic poem called In the Fish Houses. And it was one of those like sort of electric shock moments. I thought, there's Kitty. It's Kitty. She sounds something like Elizabeth Bishop. And went around I was lucky enough to find a recording of her speaking it. And every day that I wrote, I would listen to Elizabeth Bishop reading The Fish Houses. And there was something about the mood of that poem, which is elegiac, but it's also kind of tough in a way, very tough and sort of muscular. And I felt that Kitty was a sort of tough, muscular person. And the voice evolved from that point, but it was that thing that enabled me to hear Kitty sort of murmuring in my head the whole time I was writing. And all the time I'm writing, I'm speaking aloud in a Kitty voice, which is, anyway, I'm not sure if I can still do the Kitty accent, because I'm trying to write in a different voice now. But it was sort of American-ish, but I would never fool any American. And it was not really a Chesapeake Bay accent. I guess it was a little bit Elizabeth Bishop, which is Nova Scotia, not very helpful. Yeah, but I think it is, you find the thing that enables you to proceed with the writing, and this voice was that thing. I listened to a lot of recordings of Chesapeake Bay people too.
I've written that book, the poem down, so that I can look for it later, because it really is such a striking voice of a book. I actually would love to hear you read from that too, because it is so unique, her voice. So could we get you to read a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the beginning of the book, or close to the beginning of the book. And it's just a Kitty reflecting on her life, I suppose. Slice a life any way you like, and it'll tell a different story. Each cut shows something new. Each might surprise or confound. Some parts you must expose with a delicate blade to keep them whole. It's not an easy task. It takes patience. Not everyone likes to know this. You decide for yourself the things you want to know about yourself, even if not in your entirely conscious self. You choose not to peer down into the mess of it all. That's what I do. I'll admit it. I turn away. Two things come to mind, one real and one a dream, and each as true as the other. The first. I say, girl, girl, and she comes to me like a myth. Her coat sleeked smooth, her tail back out. Sorry, I should have said girl is her wolf dog. She is a line a ripple through the long grass, and butterflies and hoppers rise in her wake, lifting like spume and catching the light. She passes me by with a rush of her wind and her sweet wolf scent, leading the way to anything. Bosun's dock is Daddy's old piano with its keys unmooring, and the black notes are the dark water beneath, and girl is a dance on its broken rhythms. She looks back at me, come on. We run down the steps to the boat, and she drops in and takes her place in the bow, facing the main. I loose the old rope and step in, my feet feeling about through my thin soles for the wood and the heaving water beneath. There it is, a rise and fall, a grave pull that goes through me. Then we're together, girl, water, boat, me. For a minute, we're moving through the salted ossuary of ancient docks. Here a ribcage, there a raised arm, and at the ends of each dock the old oyster shanties, which somewhat resemble skulls with their sunken, rust-weeping eyes and raddled paint. Lines of silvered posts strike out to sea. And if I were very tall and steady of foot and impossibly agile, I would leap from one to the next across the water, and at the last one turn and see this lost world anew, a low stretch of grasses standing and falling like the pelt of a living thing on the ocean's surface. And on it, rising from it, my house, high and vast, appearing to thrust what's left of the island beneath the waves. I pull away from the island. Soon even the grasses have disappeared, and the house is nothing more than a cut-out picture, like a theatre set smacked up against the sky and the sea.
That's so beautiful. It reminded me a lot of reading Kerry Holmes, the Bone People, when I first approached this book, because it has this incredible sense of place, and also a character who's so strong. And when you said muscular with the voice, I felt that's what she was as a character. She was such a muscular character. So thank you for
pretty scary. Thanks.
I want her on my team. Back that idea of the sense of place, it goes through all three of your books, and I wonder if I can just ask generally if you feel like maybe that's because you can't write about climate change without really embedding yourself in a world or in a place, because it's happening to the place around you. So place is so important. I might open that up to the three of you. So James, do you have a comment on that one?
I'm of course now trying to think of a counterexample to that.
Go on.
Well, yes, I think you're right, but I'm of course immediately now trying to think of someone who does it without doing it, and I can't. I have to confess. I mean, the Offal book is interesting because it's it's a very urban kind of book, but its place is very it's very much about New York, so it's not about a kind of natural space. I think that's right. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it is very difficult to write about climate without writing about landscape or writing about place, because they are affected by it. And simultaneously, one of the challenges always in writing about these kinds of questions is that they are so distributed. Like that kind of sense that the interconnectedness and the distributed nature of climate change is one of the things that makes it difficult to write about. So you're always doing this kind of odd. I find you're always doing a kind of odd juggle where you're trying to write very much about the particular, but simultaneously be aware of and gesturing towards this kind of much larger crisis that it's kind of embedded within and part of.
So where did you set, can you talk about the setting for your book and why you set it there? So you set it in Tasmania.
Yeah, it's in Tasmania. And some of it's in Sydney as well. The Tasmania stuff, so I mean, I was really interested by the idea of Tasmania. Interesting enough, when I began the book, it was actually set in England. And then I had an attack of, I can't possibly write a book in England because I'm just going to get it wrong. And that was very early on. And then I decided if it was going to be here, it had to be in Tasmania. And it seemed to me that, I mean, first of all, because it is such a kind of, Tasmania has taken on all of that kind of symbolism as a place that people flee to kind of hide from climate change, as a kind of place of refuge, but also because the history of Tasmania, the experience of the Indigenous population, the symbolism of the Tasmanian tiger, all of those things seem to me, once you invoke Tasmania, they're going to be sitting in the background all of the time. And so it allowed me, in a sense, to register the interconnectedness of questions of colonialism and questions of climate without having to do them literally. Does that make sense? So I wanted this kind of feeling that those questions were omnipresent but unspoken in the novel. So yeah, I mean, the choice was very much about trying to, I guess, try and bring in that sense of, of deep time, of colonial rupture, of this kind of appalling act of genocide, so, but by setting it in Tasmania, I didn't have to say it. Does that make sense? It just sits there like this kind of elephant in the room that you can't get away from. And that was quite deliberate, No,
it does. It does a lot of the work for you, which is fantastic. Yeah. Madeleine, yours is very much a Sydney book, but you have been living in New York more often than not. Can you talk about why you set it in Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to New York in 2013 and I started writing the book in 2015. And I didn't come back to Sydney for the entire time between beginning the book and it getting sold. And so part of it was being a bit homesick, and part of it was also the feeling that, even just like being a kid, I was a big reader and I never felt like I read enough about the place that I was from versus like London and New York. Those were very like rich in my head as literary spaces and populated by literature when I go to them. Sydney less so. And because I was homesick, the things that I was reading a lot of were the things that did resonate with me a lot, that were from Sydney, which were Patrick White and Christina Stead, who are both in the sort of like Sydney books that I return to a lot of theirs. So The Vivisector for Patrick White and For Love Alone by Christina Stead. They're very, very deeply enmeshed in like the kind of stickiness of Sydney. Just the weather in Sydney is very intense. And that was also what was in my head. So part of it was wanting to write a Sydney book from the start. And then probably about a year after I'd written the very first draft, I read a book called The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. And he, in that book, basically, it's a book that's really addressed to writers. And he says, climate change is the greatest crisis of our lives, and literature isn't reflecting it. And we need to find new forms, and it needs to be addressed, because in 3 generations' time, people are going to look back at the literature that we're writing, that we're producing, and it's going to be completely irrelevant. It's not going to address what their contemporary moment will be. And then it became very clear to me, like I was feeling very anxious, and all of my anxiety seemed to be sort of like pinging off terrible things that would happen, whales beaching themselves, and like rivers filled with dead fish. And so when I redrafted it, it was very much then about elevating climate change in the way that it's experienced currently, because that was a feeling that I was having, that it's so often talked about as something that will happen, rather than the thing that we're already living through it. And I think I was very much aware of being not in Sydney, but from afar, kind of experiencing these terrible, like, fires and floods and natural catastrophes that felt at once as though, like, I wasn't there, and I was just hearing about them, and the anxiety of not being there to experience them and just having to imagine them heightened the anxiety quite a lot. So yeah, that was sort of how it all came into place, where I wanted it to be set in like a very specific place, so that it could be a petri dish to kind of link all of these other things together and just sort of like weave them together a little bit, or at least put them side by side.
Yeah. And Lucy, you actually did a couple of research trips to get that sense of place really clearly in your head, didn't you? But you chose not to set it somewhere like like you could have easily set this book somewhere like Tasmania or an island off the coast of Queensland, but instead you chose very specifically a different place, a place in America to set it.
I looked around for an Australian landscape. I started the book with an image of a house that was about the size of, was sitting on an island about the size of a suburban block, and the island was about to disappear. And in fact, it did disappear in 2011, I think. And that was in the Chesapeake Bay. So I had that kind of landscape in my head from the beginning. But realising the problem with that, I spent quite a bit of time looking around for some kind of equivalent in Australia. And although land is subsiding, I couldn't find any islands in a cold climate in Australia that were in danger of falling into the sea, that could incorporate things like refugees coming through. There were so many ideas that I was interested in exploring, or that I kept on thinking, I really want to be looking at that. And I had a kind of rough plot that I was working towards. I just thought, I've just got to stick with this. It has to be in this particular place. And fidelity to that, once you have a kind of emotional connection to something like that, an image, fidelity to that image seems to be the only way that I can keep moving forward with it. You know, I thought about Tasmania. I spent a lot of time looking up images, and none of them seem quite right. Tasmania seems pretty rocky, which I thought was inconsiderate when I was trying to set a book on a sandy kind of island. But I also didn't come at it from the perspective of deliberately writing about climate change, although I wonder if that was a kind of unconscious drive. But I just observed that if you're writing a landscape, which I'm interested in doing, and I was really interested in that landscape, you're inevitably writing climate change, even if you don't want to mention those words. That's what's happening in that landscape. You know, the islands are falling apart and disappearing. Whole villages and towns are being washed away, and all of those kind of disintegrating lives are happening everywhere you look. Yeah, but alongside that, I saw this incredible resilience, and that was something that really surprised me. And I couldn't have discovered that without going on those research trips.
That definitely comes across in your story, and the different ways that different people react to the same emergencies. You know, that some people react by closing down, becoming a vigilante, you know, fear.
Yeah.
And other people become incredibly generous and, you know, incredibly community minded as well.
Yeah, I certainly experienced both things. Not that I came across any vigilantes, but you do come across this faint hostility occasionally. But alongside that, there'll be people that could not be more hospitable, like the loveliest people.
I'm going to circle back to something that Madeleine just said about the idea that if you're writing contemporary fiction and you're not including climate change as a part of the narrative, then you're not marking the time. I wonder if all three of you have you felt that there's been a move from a time when books like these ones would be called science fiction, I suppose, and sort of dismissed as a genre that wasn't a part of the mainstream of literature, and yet there seems to have been a shift where we can actually include the near future or the present with the climate change front and centre, and still consider these books literature these days. Do you think there has been a shift? Lucy, do you think there's been a shift?
I'm a little bit doubtful about this. I think there has been a slightly incremental move in that direction. But I do think that the minute you mention climate, or you're observing climate, or you're observing the effects of climate change on landscape or on people's movements, then it will be discussed in those terms, even if you're not particularly discussing your work in those terms yourself. If you're not presenting or framing the information in a way that highlights that, that's the way that work will be framed from the moment it's published, regardless of how you try and frame it yourself. So I do think there has been some shift. I think there are more writers of what we would call literary fiction who are interested in writing in this area. But I just think there is this real thing that I feel that writers are kind of dragging the rest of the world. Like they're kind of dragging the literary world along in saying, what about a little bit more of this? And just, it's this kind of hammer and bludgeoning approach. We're going to make you accept it. This is where we are now. This is the real world. I think but I do think that change is incremental always. It's very hard to get societies to move.
How do you think people will see your book in the context of whether they'll see it as genre or they'll see it as mainstream?
Well, it was instantly framed as climate change dystopia.
Right.
And I mean, in a way, you sort of have to accept some of those frames that are, given to you and deal with that as best you can. But in my mind, it's realist, but with the kind of social effects dialed up, like maybe a couple of notches. That's what it is to me. So, I mean, it's dystopian if you accept that we live in a dystopian world now, which I think we do in a lot of ways. I just think it is really hard for people to make that shift.
Yeah.
To accept that we're there. It's not 2.5 years away. It's right now. Yeah.
Madeleine, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. It's what's happening right now. I think something that I've thought a lot about since the book came out is that for my entire life, climate change was sort of like there in the background. I remember in kindergarten being told that there was a hole in the ozone layer when we all planted trees, and the trees were going to go it was presented to us as a 5-year-old that the trees would suck the bad thing out of the air and then everything would be fixed. And there was always these kind of promises that there was a bad thing happening in nature, something was awry, but it would be fixed soon. That there were adults in the room, and I think that fell apart in my head, the feeling that like there was a bad thing that could happen, but like someone would sort it out. And there was a big conference, I think it was Copenhagen, in maybe my first year of university, and it was just a disaster. And I feel like ever since then, climate change has felt like the present that nobody's paying attention to. And it's always talked about as something that is going to happen. And it's talked about as like, well, the seas will rise this much. It's always something that's projected into the future, and it's not talked about in the way that it is right now. So certainly a thing that I tried to do in the book itself is every news instance, every like event, like every event, like every time I mention like like whales being beached and things like that, I made sure that those were all completely non-fictional. So everything came from a newspaper, it came from sources, and I made sure it all happened. It's a set in 2013, and everything happened in 2013, and everything is traceable. So none of that was, it was I think like quite important to me to have that really grounded in it being like the absolute thing that is happening. Because it's just simply not the future. And I think that a lot of younger writers are coming around to like writing about that more. I've read a lot, I think in the last like year or so, and Jenny Offal's book is the sort of big one that has sort of like brought climate change into kind of the literary fictional space, I suppose. But it's been there for years. It's just people haven't been paying attention.
Yeah. What do you think, James?
I think, I've said this before, I think there is an issue around thinking about these things as something that people kind of pick up and run with. I mean, it seems to me that kind of what Madeleine was saying, that climate is kind of environmental crisis is part of the texture of our lives. And it seems to me that we exist within a tangible condition. It's like modernity, I mean, we kind of live in a climate affected world. So you can't help but be writing about it or be not writing about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're kind of, you're stuck with, you can't help but be responding to it because it's there. But I do think the thing that's been really interesting about the last few years, particularly the last 5, has been watching, there's more and more work in the area. I think, as Madeleine just said, a lot of particularly younger writers, it's just kind of part of the texture of the books. But also what you're beginning to see is, I mean, certainly when I was writing Clade, one of the challenges was that there wasn't very much writing about climate. Most of it, I have to say, I thought was not very good. And that was partly because no one knew how to do it. And what you've kind of seen, I think, about the last 5, 6, 7 years is a kind of, you can see writers kind of finding their way into a series of kind of, narrative techniques and tropes and things that will allow them to talk about it, kind of I guess a kind of fictional language that we can use to talk about climate, and some of that's about, structural motifs, some of it's about particular kind of tropes. The family takes on a particular kind of significance often in climate fiction. And I do think that's about people finding ways of talking about it now in literature, and then it's been really interesting and I think really exciting watching that kind of blossoming. Because I mean, I would agree with Gosh that, the kind of silence in a lot of the literature is very, very frightening.
Look, I'm aware of the time. I'm aware we should take a couple of questions from the audience now. So, Emma-Kate, do we have any questions coming in?
Yes, we do. We have a few. I might start with a question from Cass. I'm going to actually tie it in with Donna's question because they are very closely linked. So Cass asks, does the dystopian style of your collective fiction represent a pessimistic view of the future? Or is it a hopeful warning about necessary change? And Donna has then asked, do you have hope?
Hope or pessimism? James, you said you're a pessimist.
I'm not sure I quite said that. I said I was ill. Look, I'm never sure. I think it's really interesting. People always want hope. I'm not sure that is a very useful frame for talking about these things. I mean, it seems to me that with questions of climate, particularly, what you've got to do is to kind of get through, it's like grieving. You've got to get through those stages of kind of, denial, bargaining, whatever, and get to some kind of acceptance. And once you're at that kind of acceptance, you know, you kind of reach a point where you kind of have to accept the reality, and then you work with it. You know, so I don't think I am a pessimist in a narrow sense. I mean, I think that, you know, people, I think the thing that's been really fascinating about the last 2 months is seeing that all of these immovable things that cannot possibly change can all change very, very fast. You know, so in a weird kind of way, the pandemic has actually been a really hopeful thing. You've suddenly seen that governments can pivot. Things can change. Things can change really, really fast if they need to. So, you know, if you want to take a kind of positive message from it, to do that. But yeah, so I mean, I think I'd just argue a bit with the framing of this kind of idea that there's optimism and there's pessimism. I'm not sure that they're the right way to be thinking about it, or hope and despair. I mean, it seems to me what you need to be is realistic and then work with what's there.
Right. Lucy, there's actually quite a lot of, there feels like there's a positivity towards the end of your book that's really quite, it's a charming, it's a lovely kind of sense of hope that I got. As a consummate pessimist, I felt like I'm reading a book that was full of hope when I came to the end of yours.
Yeah. I am not terribly optimistic, but I'm like James. We have to work with what's happening right now. And towards the end of that book, I just thought, wow, this is a really hard book. And I strongly felt that I needed to provide at least a little bit of ambiguity in the ending. And that was the best I could do. That was as hopeful as I could possibly make it, that maybe they will be okay. That's the kind of hope that I can see. And it's the hope I see generally for people, there's this incredible resilience in people. That people will get up again and again in the aftermath of catastrophe. And even in the way that we operate in our daily lives, I'm so fascinated in the way, even though people's lives kind of fell apart, they still really quickly started kind of building together these little bits and pieces that we had left, these spaces where we could communicate, ways of walking around the streets, ways to shop. And that happens all the time in the midst of places that are affected by climate change, that things are really bad. People's houses fall down, they get flooded, but they will kind of persist. And so I think there is some kind of built-in hope in that ability of people to persist. But I just think that the larger systems are really strongly against that kind of thing.
Madeleine, what's your take on this?
I mean, I guess because my book is not like of the three of our books is probably like the least dystopian, aside from there's like a kind of little 2-page essay towards the end where it jumps ahead a bit. To me, it was just depicting what is, and what is doesn't really, it's neither hopeful nor pessimism or pessimistic. It's just kind of sketching the world. And I think the idea that literature provides hope and comfort is never one that I've entirely been comfortable with. I think art does lots of things, and it depends on what the artist wants to do. But the idea that literature would sort of need to provide hope or come down on either side of it is, it feels like a kind of moralism that I'm not entirely comfortable with. And I don't think that the book is necessarily hopeful, but I don't think it has to be. I think it's just these are the worlds we're living in. I don't have an answer. Nobody has an answer, and nobody can tell you everything's going to be okay. And that it's not art's job to do that.
That's a good answer. Kate, were there other questions there that we need to get to?
Yes, we have a few more, so I'll try to get to them all. I have a quick question from you, Madeleine, from Kirsty Lee. She says, I'd love to know the book that you mentioned about writers writing about climate change. Who was that by, and what was the title, if you wouldn't mind saying?
It's called The Great Derangement, and it's by an Indian author called Amitav Ghosh, spelt Ghosh. And he's got, it's a really brilliant book that goes into like the ways that climate change is connected to imperialism and colonialism, and how it's being dealt with in art, and how he's dealt with it in his own books. And his books like Sea of Poppies is really, really wonderful.
Lovely, thank you. Teresa has asked, how much of your writing might be a search for your individual or collective human agency? How much is a grapple with culpability and corrective action? So that's for all of the panelists tonight.
Does anyone want to tackle that?
I probably wouldn't think about my writing in those terms. I wouldn't be thinking about offering advice or framing a way of seeing the world or of possibilities for the future. I would think of it more as an observational thing. And I think writers are, in some ways, writers are writing for themselves as well. They've got their own preoccupations and they're trying to work out what they think the world is like. And then that goes out to the world, and then the world gets to decide what it thinks about those things. But I feel like I can't, I'm very reluctant to be offering advice in my writing or to be suggesting that I've got some incredible insight. I've just got an insight that I'm interested in exploring. But I couldn't advise people, I don't think, or think of writing in those terms.
All three of your books sort of avoid the finger wagging or the moralizing that could happen if they weren't written so poetically, actually. So I think that the art of the writing has, certainly allows them to pose questions without pointing fingers or moralizing as well.
Yeah, Krissy, I actually think one of the issues for a lot of I think Lucy pointed this earlier, one of the issues about a lot of this kind of writing is it ends up being really instrumentalized. So this kind of thing where people constantly want to say, what's it doing? How's it going to help? Like, what's the purpose of this fiction? And it seems to me, Madeleine and Lucy both said versions of this, but it does seem to me that, first of all, that's setting the bar a bit high for a novel to kind of stop climate change. But also that it just kind of, we don't do that to other kinds of fiction. Like, why do we need this fiction to somehow do something in the world in that way? And I think simultaneously it's good if fiction does do something in the world, but this kind of sense that it needs to have this kind of practical point is quite odd, because people don't make those kind of demands of other novels.
No, that's right, exactly right. It's true.
Might just be that all the other novels are completely unpolitical, but I don't know.
It is, if you're writing a book that is engaging, in the politics of today, people feel like they have to have a takeaway from it. They feel like they have to, be taught something. But actually, can't you just engage with the novel and read it on your own terms? And I think that that's a beautiful way to engage with all three of your books as well. And was there any more questions before?
Yes, I think we've got time for one more, and then unfortunately we'll have to finish the conversation this evening. I'm sure that we could all continue for much longer. This last question is from Camden. Camden says, I'm uneasy with the term Anthropocene. In your own thinking about this moment we live in, do you prefer that term or Jason Moore's Capitalocene? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Sorry, Camden.
Anyone come back with that one?
There's a lot of scenes. There's the Aremo scene, the kind of Age of Silence. People talk about the plantation scene where they want to make the connection that really the moment of disruption is the kind of moment of kind of colonial possession of the Americas. It's not the post-war great acceleration. I don't love the term for a number of reasons, but it's kind of what the term is now. So, it's the accepted term. The stratigraphers have passed their recommendation on with it. So, it's sort of inescapable now. But no, I share some of those reservations about it. It seems to me it kind of puts us at the center and makes it sound like, there's something kind of glorifying about it, which I don't like. A kind of celebratory kind of, the Anthropocene, the age of humans, it's a bit ghastly, really.
Or is it supposed to be ghastly? Is it supposed to be about the age of humans that has created, that human created climate change, perhaps?
Yeah, that as well. But it always seems to me there's something, I don't know. I'm not crazy about the term either.
Look, we have run out of time for more questions, but I just wanted to end by thanking all three of you. Look, I was going to ask 6 more questions, and we have not had time to do it, but that's because it's been such a pleasure to listen to you all respond. And there's a chance to engage with your work further and your ideas further through the books, of course. So Emma Kate has shared the link for the books, and I'm really, would love everyone to put their hands together for all three of you. We might open the room up now so that we can have a final round of applause. And once we've opened the room, there'll be no coming back from there. It'll be me.
So I'm going to unmute you all now so that you can join me in thanking Krissy, Lucy, James, and Madeleine. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Have a lovely rest of the evening, everyone.
That's a lot of money.
Another brilliant Avid night. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, I misjudged. I'm